Exporta has become the most important congress of internationally focused companies. Therefore, year after year, service provider organizations, associations, and public and private institutions meet aiming to stimulate the international competitiveness of Spanish companies. At Exporta, seminars, workshops, and personalized interviews between companies and representatives of the economic trade offices at Spanish embassies are held to open the doors to export. Human capital, talent, and innovation are the main challenges for global companies, and also the leading concepts for Exporta 2008. In this context, the participation of Gary Becker, awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1992, is essential. Professor Becker is considered one of the greatest world specialists in human interaction and the dimension of human behavior in the ups and downs of the economy, human capital, and his talent in view of the economic challenge of the 21st century.
Thank you, Professor Becker. Thank you for accepting our invitation to participate in this Congress, Exporta. And it's for me an honor and a pleasure to talk to you this afternoon. And we want your opinion, your ideas about different points of view. Let's just start with, you have a profound influence in the field of law and economics. Your 1992 Nobel lecture was about the economic way of looking at behavior. And in that speech, you described you used economics to explore several areas of human behavior and decision making. How do you see the progress made by economic science to deal with real problems of everyday life, such as housing, quality, pollution, tax, expectancy of life, crime rates, and so on?
Economics, I think, is a powerful tool for analyzing a variety of questions, like housing, the housing crisis, like pollution problems that you mentioned, and many others. I mean, it's an imperfect tool, so we're still learning in economics. It would be misleading if I said we knew all the answers. We don't. But I do think we know quite a few answers that would be helpful if in the political arena they were adopted much more than they are.
Well, coming now to the U.S. economy and the current situation of the U.S. economy, you have done an extensive research on human capital and also social capital. How do you see the social capital now in the country? And do you think this social capital is enough to reduce or to limit the effects of a recession in the United States?
Well, first of all, it isn't clear yet that we're actually in technically a recession. We're in a slowdown. The last 3 months, the first 3 months of 2008, we actually had a slight growth in income, and usually in order to call it a recession, it takes a couple of quarters of actual decline. That may seem like a small difference, but politically it makes a big difference whether we're actually in a recession or not. Now, will we be able to limit the recession, and what will be the role of social capital? I'm not sure how important social capital will be in limiting the recession, but I am not anticipating that we will have a serious recession if we have a recession technically. I think we'll have a slowdown. It will continue for a while. We may get negative growth in income. We'll get rising unemployment, I believe, above the 5% that we have now. But I'm not anticipating a major recession. Why? I think it's basically the strengths of the economy. We've had enormous strengths in the American economy that's helped us survive. You know, the 9/11 terrorist attack, previous recessions, the war in Iraq. I think it will help us very much in this recession. Plus the global economy. People often say, well, if the United States sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. I think that's is somewhat true today, but less true than it was. But moreover, the growth in the rest of the world, in Asia, Europe, will help the U.S. economy.
Continuing with the opinion about the U.S. economy, you have stated that the big challenge of international and domestic monetary policies is to separate the economics from the politics. Often, you said, unfortunately, the politics dominates. In this context, and taking into account the problem of the moral hazard, How do you see the Fed's involvement in recent financial crises in the USA?
I think the Fed has done some very good things along with the British and the European central banks. I think they've all done some good things in responding quickly, making liquidity available. I think that was important, lowering the discount rate that they charge to banks, commercial banks and investment banks. I think all those were laudatory and helped, I think, moderate the severity of this slowdown. Now, some of the steps that the Fed has taken in particular, I'm less sure were necessary, such as the guaranteeing $25 billion worth of mortgage-backed securities of Bear Stearns. I think that's a bad precedent, and I might come to haunt the Fed in the future. But overall, I give the Fed good grades, maybe not an A+, and I'm a teacher used to giving grades, but a pretty good grade.
Thank you, Professor. And again, are you surprised by the extent of the subprime crisis, mortgage crisis in the United States? Do you have a proposal about how to prevent the next housing crisis in this country? And also about how to help those who are in danger of losing their homes because of foreclosures?
Yeah, to be honest, I didn't foresee the severity of this financial and housing crisis. Most economists knew that the increase in housing prices that were going on at such a rapid rate couldn't continue. But the magnitude of the credit involved, the quality of the debt, I didn't fully foresee. So let me state that right away. Now, in terms of how will we prevent a future crisis? It's not easy to prevent a future crisis. We may plug some holes here and there, but this crisis fed on over-optimism that housing prices will continue to rise, sometimes called a financial bubble. And most of the lending that was done and the borrowing that was made to finance housing could only be justified if housing prices continued to rise. Now, once people had that optimism, then it looked good. Yes, you didn't have the resources now, but houses would be more valuable in the future. You could re-borrow and borrow up and so on. It's hard to prevent that type of optimism. We've had those type of bubbles throughout history. I mean, it's just hard to prevent them. So I think I don't see a magic solution that's going to prevent them in the future. And that's a problem. So I think we have to take the good with the bad. I think the housing market, the financial market has been very innovative in the United States. I think it's made some important contributions to financing various activities. And maybe one of the downsides of that is that occasionally we're going to have something of a crisis. I mean, I wish I could say something more optimistic, but I'm not sure that's justified by the evidence. Now, what should we do about foreclosures? I think some of the leading political people in the United States are putting the emphasis in the wrong place. Because many of the people who borrowed in the last 2 years put almost none of their own money down. They borrowed at very low interest rates. And so when they're being foreclosed, they're not really losing a lot. Their expectations are not as good as they were, but they're not losing a lot. The people I'm more sympathetic to are people who saved much of their life to put up 20% down on their house and they lost that down payment. That's where I think if any group we want to concentrate our help. But most of the proposals are not concentrating on that group.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Again, in the same pattern of financial crisis, there's been a recent trend of people urging for regulation during the turmoil in the financial sectors and stimulating proposals to regulate extensively various types of financial institutions. What do you think about those proposals?
Some of those proposals might have merit. For example, if the Federal Reserve is to allow, as they did during this crisis, investment banks to borrow generously from the Fed, which they didn't do in the past, then you might say, well, then they should be more subject to regulation because they have access to the Fed and they have to be subject to some of the same regulation that commercial banks are. I think that makes some sense. Other regulations that I've seen suggested, I'm not confident will do more good than harm. I don't think the problem has been a lack of regulation. For example, commercial banks are one of the most heavily regulated industries of any industry in the United States. And many of the commercial banks did terribly during this. And the reason for that is that the regulators, along with those they're regulating, shared this optimism. I mean, most people, I said I didn't foresee it. Well, very few people foresaw what was happening, including the regulators. So to them, it looked like these assets had a lot of value behind them. So I don't think a greater regulation, as shown by the commercial banks, is a solution. I think both borrowers and lenders have learned some lesson from the current episode. And one of the lessons is, from the lender's point of view, is if I'm going to take mortgage-backed securities as an asset, I better be much more certain about where these assets came from, who originated them, what's the underlying collateral. And there was carelessness on that respect, and they lost money as a result of it. I think they'll be a little more careful next time.
Recently, the New York legislature of the state of New York rejected a proposal by the New York City to impose a congestion charge entering Manhattan. What do you think the legislature opposed the measure?
Well, I'm very much in support of a congestion tax. In fact, I was proposed one about 30 years ago, I think one of the first proposals on an urban congestion tax, because of the obvious problems in almost every major city now of the world. That traffic has become a huge problem. When each person considers driving, they don't consider the cost they're imposing on other drivers by slowing everything down. So a congestion tax makes good sense. I think it's helped London a lot, which is the one major city in the Western world that has introduced a congestion tax. Now, the politicians see it a little differently, however. In the United States, there's a great hostility to raising taxes. So some politicians and others and commentators see this as just another tax that will continue to be raised, not so much to help in congestion, but to get revenue for the city or whoever is imposing it. So I think that's one of the sources of the opposition, the reluctance to have another tax. And you see the truck drivers and others will be opposed to this because they see that as being a heavy tax being imposed on them. That's where the conflict between what looks to make sense from an economic perspective, from a social perspective, from a pollution perspective, from almost every perspective, doesn't often look to make sense to people who are making the political decisions.
Do you think, Professor, that the United States public infrastructure is enough to accommodate the whole growing necessities in the country?
Infrastructure is very complicated. Some people put education in infrastructure. I presume we're not talking about education in this, which I have a lot to say about. On airports, I think we do not have a sufficient infrastructure with regard to airports. There's, for example, great difficulty in extending runways at some of the major airports, like in Boston or in Chicago, because the neighbors are politically opposed to it, and they put obstacles in. We're now doing it in Chicago, but it's taken like 5 years of fighting in order to get the right to do so, and there's a lot of shortage of runways. We probably need more airports, not only new runways, but more airports. But again, it's hard to locate an airport in many communities that don't want to have an airport. When Japan built its modern airport 25 years ago, it took years and years and fights against the farmers before they were able to do that. Now you see that all over the place. So I think in air travel, definitely we have some problems in the infrastructure. In roads, well, I think the big problem is congestion, and a congestion tax, which we're unable to get. Consider that as a part of infrastructure. We're not able as yet successfully to do that in any major city, and I think that's a big problem. So building more airports, building more runways, extending urban highways, because of the political opposition now to all these type of changes, means most countries have an underinvestment in these sort of activities, including the United States.
Coming now to this recent situation in U.S. politics, and due to the exciting moment we live in the presidential campaign in the United States, in your PhD thesis dissertation about discrimination and how to measure and what are the effects it might have on the wealth, both on the discriminators and also of the victims. What is your opinion about the progress made in recent years by the black population in the United States? And do you think role is playing a role in recent presidential campaign in the country?
There's been enormous progress made, I believe, since I wrote my book. My book was my doctoral dissertation, as you mentioned, it was done in the 50s, so quite a long time ago. Discrimination against blacks, African Americans, was much more extensive then than now. As you can see it in their earnings compared to that of whites, in their occupations, in their education levels, all that far inferior to what it is now. The subsequent 50 years has been a huge progress in breaking down barriers to a more equal education. The Anti-Discrimination Education Acts that started in 1954 and have continued since then. The opening up of employment opportunities to blacks through competitive pressure and other reasons. So men and women, black men and women, have advanced greatly. They're still below. There's still, of course, room for progress. So you can either look upon it as a glass 90% full but 10% empty, or still worry about the empty 10%. I think one has to be aware of both. We've made a lot of progress. There's still progress to be made. The fact that we can now have a African American who identifies himself, he had a white mother but identifies himself as an African American, who's a very serious contender for the presidency and probably would be favored. I think he'll get the Democratic nomination. He'll probably be favored. Whether he'll win, I don't know. The fact that he could be running is a sign of great progress. Now, does race play a role? Yes. I think it still plays a role in this election. For example, he'll get like 90% of the African American vote, maybe 95% of the African American vote. So that's one way where race is playing a role. On the other hand, I'm sure there are some whites in this country who will not vote for him because he's an African American. So it's playing a role on both sides of it. It's unfortunate, but on the other hand, looking at the glass being pretty full, the fact that we're getting a serious candidate who has a very good chance of winning, I think that's a sign of great progress.
And continuing with the election, and in this case with the gender and the played role by gender in the election, you recently wrote about a fact that is a shift in college attendance rate of men and women, no? And the impact this shift will have in the economy as a whole. What do you can comment on this, and what would you see the role of gender in the presidential campaign right now?
Well, another remarkable change has occurred not only in the United States but throughout the world has been the growing education of women. In the United States currently, about 60% of those graduating from college are women. 30 or 40 years ago, that fraction was around 40%. So they've gone from being a minority in terms of college attendees and graduates to a significant majority. It's not only true in the United States. I've recently made some calculations for all the developed countries in the world. And again, in 1970, women's attendance at university, higher education as it's called in the world, lagged well behind that of men. Today, on the average, among younger women in their 30s and so on, they're getting more university education than men. So that's a remarkable change. And I think it'll impact the economy because this provides women with the background and training that it can take an increasingly important role in the economy, which they are doing. And the presidential election, again, reflects that. We've never had a serious candidate, a female candidate for the president before this election. And now we have one. She probably won't win the nomination of the Democratic Party, but she's come awfully close to winning it, and if she did win, she'd have a very good chance of winning the election. So, again, that's a sign that women are rising up in the political arena, in the economic arena. Again, as with African Americans, you can look at, is the glass empty, partly or partly filled? And same thing is true of women. Women have made enormous strides. They still lag behind that of men. I think that, so there's something, progress to be made. I think they will make more strides in the future, partly based on the fact their education now is exceeding that of men, and that will prepare them better than men in many respects to be productive, high-level employees.
Professor, even if you have now an African American and a woman, you have recently stated there's lack between the effectiveness in senior leadership position in government and the intelligence of those people. Do you see a problem in leadership in the United States right now?
Well, it's a tough question to answer. I mean, you always would like to get better leaders than one has. I mean, The political process, I think, in the United States works better than many outside commentators give it credit to. This long campaigning does reveal characteristics of the candidates that's important. I think if you look at the three presidential candidates, they're a high quality on the average. John McCain on the Republicans, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama on the Democrats. They're high-level candidates. They're intelligent. They're committed to this country. And the fact that one is a white male, one is a white woman, the other is a black male is a sign of the we're making use of the variety of talent we have in this country. So no, I don't believe on the whole, relative to the past, that we have a shortage of capable political leaders in this country or business leaders. I think we have some very capable people running, and I think it would compare with most periods of American history, aside from the revolutionary period when the country was formed, where we had just an unusually able collection of people. But most normal periods, I think our leaders today would be comparable.
Coming now to globalization, in your opinion, what are the challenges the world economy is facing today? What will be the future role of the United States in the whole context of the globalization of the world economy? And do you think there is an end for the supremacy of the dollar of recent years?
Well, I think globalization has had many major achievements in the last 30 years. You look at the growth of world trade, the growth of incomes in poorer countries, in developing countries, not only China and India, but many others. So I think we have to be proud of the achievements from globalization. Now, there are problems. There's a perception that in many countries that international trade, it hurts the country or is unfair to certain groups. We have that in many developing countries. We have that in the United States. And this election is playing a campaign. Both Democratic candidates have come out for very severely criticized free trade and openness of American markets. I think mistakenly so, but that shows they're catering to a sentiment among a significant number of Americans that somehow we've gone too far in trade and globalization. And you see that feeling in Europe, you see it in Japan, you see it in just many countries of the world. So I think that's one problem we have to be aware of. The other problem, you have this enormous rise in the price of food that has been unprecedented in modern history, has meant that the poorer individuals in poor countries who spend 60 to 80% of their income on food are suffering a lot as a result of this. When food prices have gone up like 140% in the last 5 years and 75% in the last couple of years, that's a big issue and a big problem. I think it's partly caused by some bad policies, like the biofuel policies of the United States and to some extent Europe. I think has taken corn out of production for humans and animals and into biofuels. I think that's been a mistake to do it, but it's fed and caused partly this inflation. So that's one problem. Another problem is a perception that globalization has led to growing inequality. And there's some truth to that. What globalization has done is raise the earnings of the more skilled and educated people in different economies compared to the less educated. So that is a widening of inequality. And it's up to countries to recognize this and to engage in the correct type of policies, not somehow to be sort of penalizing the educated people, but to trying to get more people who are capable of getting that education and getting them through the education. The United States educates a fairly high fraction of its population. We could do better. And Europe certainly can do better than it's doing. And I think developing countries can do better in getting higher levels of education for their countries. So these are some of the challenges brought on by the interaction, and many others, but these are some that I've been thinking about lately.
Thank you, Professor. In this context of globalization, some of the emerging economies are doing better than others. Probably the big ones like Russia, China, or India, or Brazil are doing reasonably good. What do you think of the less big emerging economies? Do you think the globalization is favoring them?
I don't think the global market favors big countries over small ones. In fact, I think to some extent it's the opposite. The reason I say I think it's to some extent the opposite is if you're a big country, you have a really large internal market. India, for example, is not so heavily involved in globalization, but has a big Indian market. China is much more involved in globalization, but still has a big and growing internal market. If you take a small country like Chile, it doesn't have much of an internal market. It has to live off of the global community if it wants to progress. And Chile is a good example of a country that has done extremely well by engaging in the global market, having a pretty free trade environment, and saying that, yes, we're going to take the pluses and the minuses of being tied in with the world economy, and they got much more pluses than they have minuses, so they've grown very well. So I think the challenge to an economy, a small economy, is to recognize that for you to grow, you're not going to be able to grow by restrictive policies, by tariffs, by imports, because your market is too small. The only way you're capable of growing at a rapid rate is by engaging in large-scale exports, which means large-scale imports, getting capital from abroad, by, in other words, participating very actively in the global market. And those small countries that have done that, I think, have been very successful. And those small countries that have the old view that you're going to be restrictive and protect domestic industries, they're the ones suffering.
Do you know that most of our audience in Spain are small and medium-sized companies, businessmen from those companies? What do you think is the model of competitiveness for this type of companies serving the global market? What do you think is the role of talent in this context?
Well, small and medium-sized companies, you know, and many of them have been very successful. I'm not an expert on the Spanish situation, so I'll speak more generally. And some of them being successful by recognizing that there is this global market that I was referring to previously, and that if they can establish a niche, and a small company can do very well in a small niche market where it's producing a particular quality of a product, and it's hard to, because it requires a lot of skill and talent. It's not easy for China or India to use unskilled labor to produce it. So I think it's no longer possible for countries in rich countries, small companies in rich countries like Spain, which is now a rich country, or Italy or the United States, to be able to compete by offering low quality products based on low skilled labor. That's China and India. They're going to, and other countries like that are going to, they control that market. You got to recognize that. If you want to compete in that market, you should have your head examined, because you can't do it because of your labor costs are too expensive and so on. But you can compete in the market that's based on quality. And they do, and many small companies are competing in that market. And that's where talent comes in. Quality requires talented entrepreneurs who are nimble enough to make the adjustments as the world demand for different types of products change. So you have to be very nimble, easy to respond. That takes talent on the entrepreneurship. And then it takes talent among the employees to be able to produce this high quality product with low scope for errors. Good quality, low margin of error, and to be able to do that. And so far, the developing countries have not been able to do that on a large scale. And that's, I think, the market for small and medium-sized companies.
Coming now to Spain, do you obviously know that Spain has undergone a very dramatic process of change in economic growth during the past 3 decades. One of the reasons for this growth has been the regulation and liberalization of the Spanish economy. But obviously we are a medium-sized country. What do you see will be the challenges facing the future of Spain to continue along this way of growth?
Well, I think liberalization is the number one essential ingredient, because, as I mentioned earlier, the prospects for a medium-sized country like Spain wants to continue growing, clearly wants to continue growing to reduce the poverty and so on in the country. You have to think of having a significant role in the global economy. And I include that as part of the EU, the European Union economy, as well as outside the European Union. So a liberalized economy is essential, being able to compete under that environment where the competition is very tough. You never know what tomorrow is going to bring in terms of a new competitor from outside, and so it's only if you have the flexibility that a liberal economy affords you, I think, that you can make those type of adjustments. So I think that's number one. The challenges, I think, will be several. I think as Spain continues to move up and develop, the importance of higher education rises. And Spain, I think, has lagged somewhat in the fraction of its population getting a higher education. Now that's a combination of government and private initiatives are necessary to achieve that. But I think that's very important to put much more resources into higher education. 30 years ago, when Spain was relatively lower income, well, then higher education wasn't so important. But now it's very important. The evidence I cited earlier, the importance of growing higher education, that's one area where I think Spain, along with a liberal economy, has to make the adjustment. The second, another aspect, a country has to get accustomed to the fact that when you're tied in with the global economy, you're benefiting from that, there are going to be some costs. Certain groups of workers are going to face competition. They may lose their jobs as a result of the globalization. Now, having a flexible economy means that these workers should find it relatively easy to find another comparable job. That's what flexibility does to you. Competition says, yes, we're not going to guarantee you your job. And Spain, I think, does too much guaranteeing still, despite all the reforms that it's had. But we're not going to guarantee you the job so much, but we're going to let competition provide this job. So yes, this sector may be being hit, but we're expanding in this sector, and they're hiring because they know of the flexibility around that. Now, that's a direction I would emphasize, and I think further liberalization in labor markets is something I've called for a long time, for Spain and Italy and some of the other countries. And Spain has made considerable progress, much more than Italy in that regard, but I think more can be done.
And also Spain has been a maverick sort of innovator in launching initiatives like the gay marriage, of a new ministry for equality. What do you think this initiative infecting the structure of the economy and the behavior of individuals? I've
always been on record as supporting gay marriage if people want to engage in those kind of marriages. I think that's a choice for individuals. In the U.S., a lot of people get hung up on whether one can use the word marriage, but I mean, I don't find that a problem, but certainly the people should be able to write contracts and effectively marriage contracts if they're gay, or whatever it may be. I think it is good for an economy. I mean, I don't think we should exclude behavior that some people may not like because it's unpopular. So I think it's valuable to move in that direction. I think that's why many countries have moved in that direction. Its direct effect on the economy is not large. It's small. But its indirect effect on having a small but vocal fraction of the population believe that they now are getting more equal rights, I think, is significant. So I know it's hard for many countries to make the changes out of traditional marriage. I've written a book on the family. I think the family is very important. Absolutely, I believe that. I think it's very important. But nevertheless, I think people should have the right, if they want to have a different sort of arrangement, such as gay marriage and a lot of other deviations from the traditional family, I think they should have that right.